There was no real reason for them to be there. I want you to actually sit with that for a second, because most people are going to hear this and try to explain it away, and I need you to resist that. There was no meeting on the calendar, no mutual friend dragging them along. No errand, no excuse, no logical thread that connects the dots between where they normally are and where they showed up that day. They were not supposed to be in that building, on that street, in that room. And yet there they were, standing at the edge of a conversation they had no business being part of, doing a very bad job of pretending it was an accident. Let's talk about who this person actually is first, because that's what makes the whole thing land differently than it would for someone else. This is not a person who wanders. This is not someone who shows up places on a whim because they're bored or restless or looking for something to do. If you know them at all, you know they run on a schedule, they plan their week on Sunday night, they don't do spontaneous. Ask anyone who's tried to get them to a last-minute dinner or a party that popped up at 9 p.m. They'll tell you the same thing. This person needs 3 days' notice and a reason. So when someone like that shows up somewhere with 0 notice and 0 reason, that's not random. That's a decision dressed up as an accident. And they weren't subtle about being bad at it either. That's actually the part that gives it away. If this had been calculated the way people calculate things in movies, they would have had a cover ready. They would have had an answer prepared for, wait, what are you doing here? Instead, when someone actually asked them that exact question, they hesitated. There was a beat. You could see them scanning for an explanation that didn't exist because they hadn't thought that far ahead. They said something about being in the area. Nobody in that group believed it, including, I'd guess, the person who said it. Here's what I think actually happened, and I want to walk you through it because the mechanics of it matter. Somewhere in the last few days, this person heard through a text, a mention, someone talking in passing, that you were going to be somewhere. And normally, hearing that a person they know is going to be somewhere does nothing. It's just information. It doesn't rearrange anyone's evening. But this time it did something different. It sat with them. It kept coming back. And at some point between hearing it and the actual day arriving, I could go turned into I'm going to go, and they never consciously decided that. It just happened, the way a thought turns into an action when you're not paying close enough attention to stop it. That's the part people miss about this kind of thing. It rarely starts as a plan. It starts as a thought that refuses to leave. You've probably had a version of this yourself. You hear someone's going to be at a place, and for the rest of the day you keep circling back to it. And you tell yourself you're not going to go out of your way for it, and then somehow you find yourself getting ready anyway, telling yourself it's a coincidence that you happen to be free that night, happen to want to go to that particular coffee shop, happen to take that particular route. It's not a coincidence, it's just easier to call it one than to admit what actually moved you. Now let's talk about you for a second, because the reason this person did this, out of character, without a plan, is not random either. There's something about the way you carry yourself around people that makes you memorable in a way you probably don't fully register. I'm not talking about being loud or being the center of attention. A lot of the people this happens to are actually the opposite, quiet, observant, the kind of person who listens more than they talk, who remembers small details other people forget, who treats a conversation like it actually matters instead of just filling silence until it's their turn to leave. That's rare. Most people are performing some version of themselves in every interaction, calculating how they're coming across. You don't do that, or at least you don't do it as much as most people do, and it's noticeable, even if nobody says it out loud. Here's the thing about being that kind of person. It usually comes from somewhere. People aren't naturally still and present like that. Most of us have to learn it, and a lot of the time we learn it the hard way. Maybe you spent a lot of your life around people who weren't really listening to you, who were physically present but somewhere else the whole time, and you decided early on that you weren't going to do that to anyone else. Maybe you had to learn to pay close attention to people as a kind of survival skill, because the version of you that didn't pay attention got hurt, missed warning signs, trusted the wrong things. Whatever the specific reason, the result is the same. You turned into someone who actually shows up when you're in a room with someone, fully, not halfway, checking your phone, waiting for a better conversation to start somewhere else, all the way in. And people feel that. They might not be able to name it, they might not even consciously notice it in the moment, but they feel the difference between being talked at and being actually seen. It changes how a conversation sits with someone afterward. Most interactions evaporate within a day. You forget what was said, who said it, how it felt, but a conversation with someone who was genuinely present doesn't evaporate the same way. It sticks. It gets replayed later, usually without the person even meaning to replay it. They'll be doing something completely unrelated, driving, doing dishes, lying in bed, and a specific thing you said, or the way you laughed at something, will just surface, uninvited, and they'll sit with it longer than they mean to. That's what happened here. Somewhere along the way, probably in a conversation you don't even remember being particularly significant, you became one of those people this person can't fully put away. And I want to be specific about what that actually feels like from their side, because it's not romantic in the movie sense. It's more like an itch that doesn't have a name yet. They'll be in the middle of something else entirely, and your name will come up in their head for no obvious reason. They'll hear a version of something you said used by someone else and feel a small, strange disappointment that it wasn't you saying it. That's not something people plan or choose. It's just what happens when someone lodges themselves somewhere in your attention without asking permission to be there. So when they heard you'd be at that place on that day, it wasn't really a decision in the way decisions usually work. It was closer to gravity. They tried, probably, to talk themselves out of it. I'd bet money there was an internal argument that went something like, "That's a weird thing to do, and you don't even have a reason to go, and what if it's obvious why you're there?" And normally that internal argument wins. Most people, most of the time, let the logical voice win, because showing up somewhere for a reason you can't say out loud feels exposing in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable. It requires admitting, even just to yourself, that you want something you don't have a clean explanation for. But this time the logical voice lost, and I think that tells you more about how much this person actually wanted to see you than anything they could have said directly. Words are easy to plan. You can rehearse a sentence, edit it, decide exactly how much to reveal and how much to hold back. Showing up somewhere with no cover is much harder to fake because it costs something real. It costs the risk of looking obvious, of being asked a question they don't have a good answer for, of you noticing exactly what you noticed, which is that there was no real reason for them to be there except one. Think about the actual logistics of what they did, because the logistics are where the truth usually hides. Showing up somewhere on short notice isn't just a feeling, it's a series of small practical decisions that all had to happen in a short window. They had to rearrange whatever they had planned for that day, or cancel it, or push it. They had to figure out how to get there, which, depending on where they live, might not have been simple. They had to walk in not knowing exactly how the moment would go, whether you'd be glad to see them or confused, whether the group around you would ask questions they didn't have answers for. None of that is comfortable. People don't sign up for that level of social risk over nothing. If it really had been just being in the area, there would have been an easy way to prove that, a reason so mundane nobody would have thought twice about it. Instead, there was a pause, and a half-answer, and a subject change. Pay attention to what people do when they're caught off guard by their own behaviour, because that reaction is almost always more honest than anything they say once they've had a few seconds to recover. I also want to talk about the version of this that happens quietly, because not everyone who does this makes it as visible as showing up in person. Sometimes it looks smaller. Sometimes it's someone who suddenly starts frequenting a coffee shop they never used to go to because they found out it's the one you go to on Tuesdays. Sometimes it's someone who joins a group chat, a class, a gym, a project at work, and later, if you ever actually asked them straight up why, they'd struggle to give you a reason that isn't you. The showing up in person version just happens to be the loudest, most obvious form of a pattern that usually starts much smaller and much earlier than the moment you actually caught it happening. By the time it's visible enough for you to notice, and for other people around you to notice, and comment on it, and ask the very question that made this person stumble, it's usually already been building quietly for a while. What you saw wasn't the beginning. It was just the first moment it got too big to hide. There's also something worth saying about how differently this reads depending on who's doing it. If this were someone who does this kind of thing often, shows up places, inserts themselves into plans, runs hot and then cold depending on their mood, I'd tell you to be careful, because that's a pattern of its own, and it isn't usually about you specifically, it's just how that person operates with everyone. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone whose entire personality runs in the opposite direction, consistent, predictable, rarely spontaneous about anything, let alone about people. That's exactly why this particular instance carries weight that it wouldn't carry from someone who does this all the time. Rare behavior from a consistent person tells you more than constant behavior from an inconsistent one ever will, and I know the voice in your head that's ready to talk you out of taking this seriously. That voice is going to say something like, maybe they were just bored, or maybe it really was a coincidence, or you're reading too much into a normal thing. And look, sometimes that voice is right. Not every coincidence is meaningful, and I'm not telling you to build a whole out of nothing, but you know the difference between an actual coincidence and this. You were there, you saw the hesitation when they were asked why they'd come. You noticed the way their explanation didn't quite land, even to them. Trust what you actually observed over the version of events that would be easier and safer to believe. The easier explanation isn't automatically the true one, it's just the one that protects you from being disappointed if you're wrong. And here's something worth sitting with. The discomfort of taking it seriously usually isn't really about doubting them. It's about the risk of being wrong in front of yourself. If you let yourself believe this meant something, and it turns out it didn't, that stings in a specific, private way. So it can feel safer to just decide it was nothing before anyone gets the chance to prove that theory wrong. But safety bought that way is expensive. It costs you the ability to actually notice when something real is happening in front of you because you've trained yourself to explain it away before it can become anything. Let me tell you what I think is actually going on with this person right now, because I don't think showing up was the end of I think it was the first crack in something they've been holding together for a while. People who plan everything, who don't do spontaneous, who need 3 days' notice for dinner, that's not just a personality quirk. A lot of the time, that kind of control is a way of managing something. Maybe they've been burned before by moving too fast, saying too much, showing their hand before they were sure it was safe to. Maybe they learned that being unpredictable, wanting something visibly, costs you something if it doesn't work out the way you hoped. So they built a version of themselves that doesn't do that anymore. Controlled, scheduled, nothing left to chance, because chance is where you get hurt. And then you happened, and the careful version of them started to slip in small, specific ways they probably didn't even notice at first. Showing up somewhere with no plan is exactly the kind of thing that version of them doesn't do. It's out of character in a way that should tell you something, because people don't abandon years of habit for nothing. They abandon it when something matters enough to override the habit, even briefly, even against their own better judgment. I'd guess that right now, if you asked them directly why they were there, they'd deflect. They'd probably laugh it off, say something dismissive, change the subject fast. That's not because it didn't mean anything. It's because admitting what it actually meant requires a kind of honesty that's genuinely hard for someone who spent a long time being careful. Saying, "I heard you'd be there and I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I came," is a sentence that exposes a person completely. It hands you information they can't take back. Most people, even people who feel something strongly, aren't ready to say that sentence out loud the first time it becomes true. It usually takes several more moments, like the one you just had, before someone works up to actually saying the thing plainly. So don't expect a grand confession right away. Expect more of this instead, more reasons that don't quite add up, more places they happen to be, more conversations that run a little longer than they need to, more attention that's obvious to everyone except, apparently, the person giving it. That's usually how it goes with people who aren't used to wanting something out loud. The wanting shows up in actions long before it shows up in words, because actions feel less risky. You can always explain an action away. A sentence, once you've said it, is out there for good. What I'd suggest is this: don't force it, don't corner them and demand an explanation for showing up, because that will probably just make them retreat further into the safe, scheduled version of themselves, and you'll lose the momentum of whatever's actually happening. Let the pattern keep showing itself. Notice it the way you're clearly already noticing it, and give it room to become obvious on its own terms instead of yours. People who are careful by nature need time to get comfortable with wanting something visibly. Rushing that usually backfires. It either scares them back into their shell, or it forces a conversation before they're actually ready to be honest in it, which tends to produce a half answer that satisfies no one. In the meantime, keep being exactly who you've been, because that's clearly what got their attention in the first place. Not a performance, not a strategy, just the version of you that actually shows up fully in a room, that listens instead of waiting for your turn to talk, that treats people like they matter instead of like an audience. That's the thing that pulled someone out of a routine they don't break for anyone. It'll keep doing that. You don't need to change anything about how you're moving through this. You just need to actually let yourself see it for what it is, instead of talking yourself out of it because the alternative is more comfortable. One more thing before I let you go. Notice how you feel reading this back, honestly. If none of it landed, if it doesn't match anything in your life right now, that's fine. Let it go. It wasn't for you today. But if there's a specific person's face that showed up in your head, somewhere around the third sentence of this and hasn't left since, that's worth paying attention to. That reaction isn't nothing. Your gut usually knows before the rest of you is willing to admit it out loud, and it's telling you something right now if you're honest enough to listen to it. If this described something you actually lived through, tell me in the comments what the excuse was, the thing they said when you asked why they were there, the one that didn't quite hold up. I want to hear the actual line, because there's always one, and it's usually the most telling part of the whole plot. Like this video if it hit close, subscribe if you want more of these, and send it to the one friend who's currently convincing herself it was just a coincidence when she knows exactly what it was. I'll see you in the next one.